Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to Conversations in the Digital Age. With us is Joseph A. Califano, Jr. Joe Califano has had an enviable career in public service. He was the principal domestic advisor to President Lyndon Johnson from 1965 to 1969, a period of 3.5 years. He also served as Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in the Carter administration, and he has just come out with a republication of his extraordinary book, The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson. And we're delighted to have you with us, Joe. We're honored to have you with us to tell us about your book and perhaps recount a few war stories of what happened in the Johnson White House.
Well, it's great to be here, and God knows there are plenty of war stories.
Well, you call it, I'm always curious about titles. You call it The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson. I remember Churchill called the last volume of his 6-volume work on the Second World War Triumph and Tragedy. What was Johnson's triumph and what was his tragedy?
Well, the triumph was, of course, to me, the Great Society. I mean, I believe changed the country. And if you just think about it for a second, the Medicare and Medicaid in the health area, as well as thousands of community health centers. In higher education, 60% of the kids in college today are there on his work-study, grant and loan programs. In the environment, he's the president that established the principle, not just keep the land that's not been touched, but the obligation of those who defile the land to repair it, clean air, clean water, motor pollution, all that stuff, great beautification. The civil rights laws, the 64 Act, which prohibited discrimination in employment or public accommodations, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Fair Housing Act of 68, and people don't usually count it, but the immigration law, which has changed America. When Johnson was president, we had the National Origins Act, which largely limited immigrants to Britain and Northern Europe. Johnson busted that open with immigration reform, immigrants from all over the world. And as a result, 85% of the immigrants to this country come from Asia, Africa, South America, the Middle East, only 15% from Northern Europe. And that's a complete flip of the way it was. And in the arts, public broadcasting, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, public radio, we have about 900 stations. Public television, we got about 400 stations. It was incredible. That was the triumph.
Well, it's an amazing record of legislative accomplishment. I mean, you think of most presidents who serve 8 years, Bill Clinton or Bush, maybe, or even Obama, one major piece of legislation in 8 years. Johnson had hundreds, didn't he?
He had hundreds, and it kept coming, and that was, and they had phenomenal impact. I mean, 2/3 of the Americans in nursing homes today are having their bills paid by Medicare and Medicaid, for example. You can't imagine, as the Washington Post put it, you can't imagine a country without the Great Society. The tragedy, of course, was the Vietnam War. He got into that war, built it up. He desperately tried to end it on his time. In 1968, he withdrew from the running for re-election. That speech was devoted, half of it to the bombing pause and getting the North Vietnamese to the table, half of it to getting his tax bill passed. He did get the North Vietnamese to the table. They did start talks. And then two things happened ultimately. The Russians invaded Czechoslovakia. And Nixon, through Anna Chennault, said to the South Vietnamese, don't make the deal Johnson's pushing. You'll get a better deal with Nixon. And he was not unable to end the war.
Did they get a better deal with Nixon?
They got a better deal than Johnson would have offered at that time. And it was certainly a better deal for the 20 or 25,000 people that were killed as a result of the war continuing for 4 years under Nixon and Kissinger.
Now, in your book, you describe a great deal of the human side of Johnson. You characterize him as, among other things, altruistic, petty, cunning, crude, petulant, compelling, controversial, bluntly honest, calculatingly devious, all at the same time. Well, which was he? What was his predominant characteristic?
Well, he was all of those things. You know, he really was all of those things. You know, he could do wonderful things. If you think of New York, Hugh Carey, the former governor, there was a elementary and secondary education aide to those public schools. Never could get it passed because the Catholics blocked it unless they got money for the Catholic schools, and the evangelicals and the secular urban Jews blocked it if it did get money for parochial schools. And it became even more difficult with Johnson.
And Carey was then in Congress.
Hugh Carey was in Congress in a district in Brooklyn. And it was more difficult because Adam Clayton Powell, a Harlem congressman, was chair of the Education Committee, and the race issue injected in there. So what Johnson did was, first, he asked Adam Clayton Powell to get out of town and turn it over to Hugh Carey. Powell went to Bimini. Some may remember he basically never came back from Bimini. Johnson got Cardinal Spellman, who was then the spokesman for the Catholics, Billy Graham, spokesman for the evangelicals, and Arthur Goldberg, and got them in the pool, not in the pool, but standing next to the pool, the hottest room on God's earth.
You were there?
The White House. I was there. And George Christian and I standing by the side watching.
Not in a bathing suit.
Not in a bathing suit, nobody in a bathing suit. It was so hot that you could see the sweat through Cardinal Spellman's cassock. And he pressed, Carey had an idea, lease the Catholic schools secular books and equipment. And Johnson sold that in that meeting to them. He was so appreciative of Carey's idea that he asked the House to hold up sending him the bill until he was back from a trip so he could sign it on Hugh Carey's birthday. And why Carey? Carey had a district in Brooklyn, Johnson knew this, that had Orthodox Jews, 2 or 3 Catholic colleges and high schools, and an evangelical center. So Carey knew those groups. It was that kind of shrewd playing. And that was all wonderful. I mean, on the other hand, he could say, you know, Dick Ottinger was a congressman from Westchester. And we were trying to get the debt limit raised to get more money for the Great Society programs. And Ottinger was among 6 Democrats that voted against it, and we lost the vote, and we had to turn them around. And Johnson was looking it over, and on the floor, Ottinger said, among other things, you know, we're pouring money in the Vietnam War. We don't have enough money for public housing. And LBJ said to me, he said, Joe, call up Ottinger. You tell him we have plenty of money for public housing. In fact, we're going to put the biggest damn public housing project in the history of the country right in the middle of his fancy Westchester district. And I did. And Ottinger changed his vote. I mean, he was capable of that, too.
Well, he had a way of cajoling Congress, and also chicanery was certainly not above him. But tell the story about Russell Long and the appointment of the Federal Reserve Board.
Oh, he loved, you know, we were at, you know, we had a lot of tension with the Federal Reserve Board. William McChesney Martin, the great financier from Wall Street, had been chairman of the board for a decade and a half. He had a 4-3 vote, 4 for starting to raise the interest rates, 3 for the low interest rates. One of the 4 was leaving the board. Johnson was going to appoint someone. I got a call from Bill Martin. Bill said, Joe, I want you to let the president know that if he puts another liberal on the board, I'm going to resign. So I told that to the president. The president said, we'll get the right person. And then a day or two he said, we're going to appoint Andrew Bremer to the vacant seat. Bremer was a good, low-interest rate liberal in the Commerce Department, and Bremer was African-American. And Johnson said, let Bill Martin resign because the first African-American is on the board. I don't think he'll want to be called a racist. And then the next problem was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee was Russell Long. Russell Long from Louisiana opposed us on every civil rights bill every Great Society program. Johnson called him over. That committee had to approve the new appointment. And Johnson said, the little green office next to the Oval Office, and he said, Russell, I've got the guy for the Fed. And he describes Andrew Bremer, Harvard, and MIT, this great record, great economist. And he said, and Russell, he was born in Louisiana. Russell says, born in Louisiana? And Johnson said, yes. And that's why I want you to introduce him to the committee and you to promote him. Russell said, I will, Mr. President, I will. And then Johnson says, and here's a folder, gives him a manila folder, with some real information about it. You open the folder, the first picture is a picture of Andrew Bremer. And Russell sees this black face, kind of gags a little bit, but he kept his word. They did in those days.
Must have turned...
Johnson loved to do things like that.
Long must have turned white as a sheet, whiter than he was anyway. So you mentioned the arts. Tell the story about Claiborne Pell and the Hirshhorn Museum. That's just priceless.
Well, Claiborne Pell of the Pells, a descendant, was the chair of the subcommittee that controlled the arts. Lady Bird went to Connecticut and saw this incredible sculpture owned by a guy named Joseph Hirshhorn, who was a Latvian Jew.
An immigrant.
Immigrant.
Yeah.
And she came back and she said, Lyndon, I've never seen anything like it. We got to get it for the government. He's willing to give it to the United States. And there was one hitch. He wanted the museum named after himself. So Johnson said, fine. We send it up, the proposal to create the Hirshhorn Museum on the Mall, and Pell opposes it, says it ought to be the Smithsonian, should not be named the Hirshhorn Museum. And Harry McPherson and I went up to see him, and we had no success. And Johnson says, bring him, let's get him down here. Johnson gets him again in that little green office he loved to use. And he said, Claiborne, and he tried to talk to him, and Claiborne Pell said, oh, Mr. President, it's the Smithsonian, we don't do things like this. And Johnson looks at Claiborne Pell. He says, Claiborne, I don't care if they want to call it the Horseshit Museum. I want the American people to see this art. And the only way they're going to see it is if he has his name. And Pell was all shaken and embarrassed, didn't budge, left. But 2 days later, he called and said, okay, go with it. And the Hirshhorn Museum stands in Washington today.
Stands today. Now, you've described a man who had an extraordinarily mischievous sense of humor. Do you have any other examples of a sense of humor that you can recount?
Oh, well, there are a lot. I mean, he would...
How about the Stokely Carmichael example?
Well, I'll give you two. One was Frank Church of Idaho was constantly saying to Johnson, Walter Lippmann, the great columnist that day, suggests you do this with Russia. Walter Lippmann suggests this with Vietnam. Walter Lippmann this. And Johnson turns to Church one day and he says, Frank, the next time you want a dam on the Snake River in Idaho, call up Walter Lippmann. But Carmichael was an incredible... This is a kind of tough humor I think you really need in politics. Martin Luther King is assassinated. It was the worst week of the Johnson presidency. He had me move into the White House to live there. I would bring him executive orders to sign. We had troops in 6 cities. We had riots in 100 cities. And one night, I bring him this report from Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover. Stokely Carmichael, the Black Firebrand, is organizing a mob at 13th and U to march on Georgetown and burn it down. And Johnson, Georgetown was where all the TV commentators, all the columnists, all the reporters for the Times and the Post that drove Johnson crazy lived. And Johnson looks at this, reads it aloud, and he says, God damn, I've waited 35 years for this night.
That's terrific. Now, one of the items that you have in the book, and which was largely overlooked by the press when the book first came out, and now you've reissued it and you say we're living today in Lyndon Johnson's America. But one is the strange relationship he had with Justice Abe Fortas. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's really, it was, Fortas was Johnson's lawyer, Forbes is the guy that won the case when Johnson won by, 47 votes, the Senate?
Right.
He called him landslide Lyndon. I'd been to the White House about 2 weeks, and we were driving back from the Pentagon, and Johnson was going to announce the buildup of Vietnam troops in July of '65. And he said, we ought to have some other news, and one item of the other news was, we'll announce a new Supreme Court justice. So Bill Moyer says to me, you write that. I said, fine, I got tomorrow. I didn't know who it was going to be, so I called the president. And he said, just write a paragraph about a very distinguished Washington lawyer. I did. I rushed it into him. I go into the Oval Office, and there's Abe Forbes sitting there. Johnson reads it. He says, fine. And then he says to Forbes, I'm putting you on the Forbes does not want to go on the court. I'm putting you on the court. You can either watch it on television from here, or you can come with me. Forbes came with him. We went back to, he had lunch with him, then I took Forbes back to his house. We stopped at his house, and there was a big rectangular hole above the steps that you walked up in the house. And he said, that was going to be my central air conditioning. I can't afford it now. Johnson never left Forbes alone. He talked to him all the time.
While he was on the bench?
While he was on the bench. They passed a bill about pornography that was probably unconstitutional. The issue was whether to veto it or not. Forbes was over there. And Forbes and I wrote the veto message for the president. Probably the most egregious example, I guess is the only way to describe it. People may remember the Penn Central merger. It was the biggest merger of its time. It was incredibly controversial. It was before the Supreme Court. Forbes was on the Supreme Court.
This is in 1966.
1966. It was Thanksgiving weekend. Stuart Saunders, the head of the who wanted the merger, was staying at the hotel right across, the Hay Adams Hotel right across from the White House in Lafayette Square, all Thanksgiving weekend. I was in the office all Thanksgiving weekend. The Justice Department opposed the merger. The Department of Transportation favored the merger. Johnson had me bring these people, the cabinet officers, together on Thanksgiving Day to meet with them and hash this out. I called Thurgood Marshall, the Solicitor General.
And this is a case before the Supreme Court.
It's a case before the Supreme Court, and the president says, talk to Abe Forbes. I called Forbes, and Forbes suggested that the brief of the government should have something in it that says the department responsible for the public policy relating to transportation believes this should be approved. And I had that. I talked to Thurgood Marshall to try and get him to do more. We sent the head of the Council of Economic Advisors and others over to Thurgood Marshall, who did not appreciate this. He was in Atlantic City, came back, the brief ultimately got changed, and that line is in the government brief.
And you wrote it.
And we wrote it.
I wrote it in the White House.
We wrote it in the White House. The case goes before the court. It was there actually twice. But in the final resolution of the case, Abe Forbes writes the decision for the court, citing the language that he asked us to get put in the Thurgood Marshall's brief. Unheard of, I think. And my understanding is that there are no limits on what justices can do. There are no rules, so to speak.
Yes, the canons of judicial ethics don't apply to Supreme Court justices. They apply to all the other federal judges, but not to them.
And we talk to Forbes all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, he was over there. We would have strikes, and we'd get Forbes over there. He was over there a lot on issues related to the war. But on domestic, when we get into a real domestic crisis, Abe Forbes was there more often than not. And then when Johnson nominated him to be Chief Justice, in his hope to keep the court liberal, after Earl Warren told him he was resigning, Forbes was filibustered. We could not break the filibuster. We got a majority of votes for him. We couldn't break the filibuster. And his testimony was disingenuous, let's say.
Appears before the Senate.
Appears before the Senate.
Judiciary Committee. And he's asked, what have your contacts been with the president? What does he say?
Well, he says very limited. And he never, never laid out what his contacts had been with the president. And they knew it, and I think that killed him. And also, we were out of steam. I mean, it was late 1968. We didn't have the juice to get more than about 53 or 54 votes. Johnson wanted the vote, even though he knew we couldn't break the filibuster, because he said he wanted Abe to know he got a majority of the votes. But it was a remarkable thing. And then, as you undoubtedly remember, Jim, a year or so later, Fortas got into trouble with respect to some money he got from Lou Wolfson and had to resign from the court.
Fascinating account.
I think what happens in Washington is you reach a point where you think you can do anything and you're above anything. A little of that also happened to Clark Clifford. I think that happened to some extent to Abe Fortas.
We hear so much these days, Joe, about the dysfunction in Washington, that the president can't get the Congress to agree with him on anything, and as a result we have gridlock and paralysis and nothing gets done, and which is certainly not the case in the Johnson administration. Now the Obama people say the reason is that they have the Tea Party, and the Tea Party is an insurmountable obstacle, but Johnson had the Southern Democrats in his own party.
We did. We had.
And if Johnson were in there today, do you think he'd be more successful than Obama in getting things done?
Absolutely.
And why is that?
Absolutely. Well, I think he knew these guys. He certainly knew the procedures. I mean, as Richard Russell, a great, powerful Southern senator from Georgia, said, we could beat Jack Kennedy, but Lyndon is going to beat us. And it's a lot of things. One is just the sequence in which you present legislation. Remember, he insisted on going with the Civil Rights Act on accommodations and discrimination in 1964, right after his first State of the Union. It was a big part of his first State of the Union. You look back and you say, why? Why? Because he wanted that act there and on the books before he started pushing them for Medicare, Medicaid, aid to education, all programs that would subject the recipients to anti-discrimination. If he had reversed it, he never would have been able to do it. Second, and also he got all the appropriations bills and a tax cut all passed before he went to get his Civil Rights Act in 64. That's number one. Number two, he knew these guys intimately. I mentioned before, imagine of all the congressmen you picked to deal with this complicated Catholic, evangelical, racial issue relating to public schools, he picks a congressman who has all of those factors in his district and been reelected several times to try and figure out how do you do it. He knew things like that. And he was willing to give. We gave a lot. To get the Republicans aboard he wanted the Republicans aboard on Medicare and Medicaid. Compare this with Affordable Care. Because he said, if we don't have them aboard, they'll kill us in appropriations. What's happened to Obama? There are very limited appropriations for long-term care and other things, the Affordable Care Acts, and for some of the things, none. They'll kill us in the states, the Republican governors. What's happened? There are Republican states that are real problems in terms of affordable care. We needed the Republican governments to run Medicaid. So he was willing to give. He was willing to take half a loaf and come back for another bite, but he wanted to get it in. And he was very conscious of passing a law. Obama's executive orders, if there's a Republican president, and maybe even if it's Hillary, will be changed or revoked. When there's a law, it's very tough to change.
It's interesting you mentioned Hillary, because one of the items of unfinished business, perhaps, in his administration was the issue of women in positions of power in government. And I think you recount in the book a conversation you had with him about women generals, women admirals. Perhaps. Well,
he said no. He started what a feminist historian wrote in a book, saying that it was the first affirmative action program for women in the history of government was in the White House. He was constantly hectoring his people to appoint women to top jobs, and he passed something called equality, I forget the name of it, but it was basically to provide equal opportunity for women officers in the military. And when he signed the bill, his statement said, someday we'll have women admirals and women generals and even a woman female commander-in-chief.
A woman female commander-in-chief. Joe Califano, this has been just marvelous, and I'm sorry we've run out of time, but this has been terrific. Thank you so much for coming by.
It's a great show. I very much enjoyed it.
Well, it's a great show because you've been on it, and I thank you very much, and I thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. Please visit our website at www.digitalage.org. I am Jim Zirin. All the best. Take care. That was terrific.